The crimson verdict was not a sentence that could be appealed. Marina Davenport knew this the moment she burst through the iron doors of the Velkan court's inner sanctum, her white coat still smeared with the blood of the vampire she had spent 3 hours trying to stabilize in the antechamber. Her hands shaking not from exhaustion but from the cold, absolute fury rising through her chest as she saw what was happening at the center of the great obsidian chamber. Silas Velkan was on his knees. Silas Velkan, the most powerful vampire lord in the Eastern Covenant, the man who had walked into her clinic 6 months ago with a knife wound that should have been impossible for his kind to sustain. The man who had watched her work with those pale silver eyes filled with something she had not yet named. The man who had stood between her and every threat this hidden world had ever thrown at her was on his knees before a tribunal of 7 vampires, so ancient their white hair moved like smoke in the still air of the chamber, above his bowed head. Suspended in the space between 2 carved obsidian pillars, burned the crimson verdict. It was not fire exactly. It was not light exactly. It was the color of arterial blood made into a hovering, pulsing sentence, and it bore his name, and it meant that in 17 hours the Covenant's oldest and most absolute blood law would consume him entirely, unmake his immortality, unravel the very thread of what he was, and leave nothing. Not death in the way Marina understood death. Something worse. Erasure. She did not stop walking. "Remove the verdict," she said, and every head in the chamber turned toward her. The 7 council elders stared at her with the particular brand of contempt that immortal beings reserved for humans who forgot to be afraid. Their faces were carved things, white as marble, sharp as architecture. The eldest among them, a woman called Vraska, whose hair was so white it appeared to generate its own pale luminescence, rose slowly from her high seat and looked at Marina the way one looks at something that has stumbled into a room it does not belong in. "The human healer," Vraska said, and the words were not a greeting. They were a category, an assessment, a dismissal wrapped in civility. Silas turned his head. Marina would remember that moment for the rest of her life. The way he turned, still on his knees, still bearing the weight of the verdict's crimson glow above him, and looked at her with those silver eyes. And what was in them was not hope. It was something more complicated than hope. It was the expression of a man who had spent centuries building walls and had turned around to find that someone had already lived inside them. And the sight of her standing there, refusing to be small, had undone something in him that no blood law ever could. "Marina," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the way it always was when he was afraid she was about to do something that would get her killed. "Leave this chamber." "I will not," she said. She turned back to Vraska, and she set her medical bag down on the obsidian floor, and the sound it made was clean and declarative. "I want to know the exact charge," Marina said. "I want to know every specific violation of blood law that has been cited. I want to see the original testimony, and I want to understand the mechanism of the crimson verdict so I can determine whether there is a medical or biological counter-argument to its execution." The silence that followed was extraordinary. It was the silence of 7 beings who had collectively lived for thousands of years, none of whom had ever had a human woman walk into a crimson verdict, proceeding and demand documentation. Vraska tilted her head. Something moved behind her ancient eyes that might, under different circumstances, have been respect. "You are very brave," Vraska said. "I am very informed," Marina replied. "Which is more useful?" The story of how Marina Davenport came to stand in the innermost sanctum of the Eastern Covenant's hidden court, facing down a tribunal of elder vampires on behalf of the man she loved, had begun 6 months earlier in the least romantic setting she could have imagined, which was her clinic at 2 in the morning, while rain came sideways off Lake Michigan. And she was trying to eat cold soup between patient charts. Marina ran a private medical practice that existed, technically, in the basement level of a glass-fronted building in the arts district of the city, and technically was perhaps the wrong word. The practice existed in the basement level of a glass-fronted building in the arts district. Yes, but the actual work she did was not listed on any board or directory, and her patients were not the kind of people who filled out insurance forms. She had stumbled into this arrangement 3 years ago when her residency supervisor, a dry-eyed Austrian named Dr. Felder, who had since disappeared in a way she now understood, had handed her a sealed file, and told her that certain segments of the city's population required medical care that did not appear in any textbook, and that she had demonstrated unusual aptitude for adapting her knowledge to unusual problems, and that she could accept the file or not, but once she knew, she would always know. She had accepted the file. She had been treating vampires, and the occasional other category of beings she had learned to identify without asking too many questions ever since. The vampires she treated were not the monsters of old stories. They were, in her clinical experience, extraordinarily frustrating patients. They had immortal healing capabilities that made most injuries eventually self-resolving, which meant they never came to her unless the injury was something their healing could not resolve, which meant everything she saw was catastrophic by definition. They were proud, they were difficult, they understated their symptoms to a degree that would have been medically dangerous if they were human, and they had a deep cultural aversion to admitting vulnerability that she had spent 2 years learning to work around. She had developed a manner with them, direct, unimpressed, precise. She did not flatter them. She did not flinch from them. She spoke to them the way she spoke to anyone else in her examination room, which was to say, with complete authority about her own domain. They respected this. In the particular social architecture of vampire culture, competence was the only currency that mattered, and she had competence in abundance, but she had not been prepared for Silas Velkan. He arrived on a Tuesday. He came without warning, without an escort, without the usual coded message through the network of intermediaries she had built up over 3 years. The door of her clinic simply opened, and he was there. And he was so obviously and immediately different from every other patient she had ever treated that she had set down her pen and simply looked at him for a full 3 seconds before she caught herself. He was tall in the way that not just physical height, but a kind of spatial authority, as though the room had quietly rearranged itself around him the moment he stepped into it. His hair was white, the particular white of vampire aristocracy, worn past his shoulders in a way that suggested age and old-world custom rather than any contemporary aesthetic. His face was the kind of face that appeared in historical paintings of figures who had shaped the fates of nations, and all clean, severe angles and a jaw that looked like it had been designed to express controlled displeasure, and his eyes were silver, true silver, the color of old mirrors, and they assessed her with the same unhurried precision she suspected he brought to everything. He was wearing a black coat over what appeared to be a very expensive shirt, and the shirt had a spreading dark stain over his left side that she recognized immediately as blood, and the blood was his, and the wound beneath it was wrong in the way that made the back of her neck prickle. "Sit down," she said, because whatever else he was a patient, and patients sat down. Something flickered in those silver eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or the closest approximation to it that a man like this allowed himself. He sat down. The wound was a blade injury, she determined quickly, but the blade had been treated with something that disrupted vampire healing at the cellular level. She had seen this twice before. The work of vampire hunters who had learned to weaponize their knowledge of supernatural biology. The other 2 cases had been straightforward. The disrupting compound identifiable, the treatment a matter of neutralizing the compound and allowing the natural healing to resume. This was not straightforward. Whatever had been used on Silas Velkan was older and more sophisticated than anything she had encountered before. The disruption was not chemical in a way she could simply neutralize. It was, in some sense, she was still working out the vocabulary for, trying to tell his own biology that he did not exist. "Who did this?" she asked, because it mattered for treatment. "That is not relevant to your work," he said. "It is relevant to my work if the compound they used is still active, and they are still in the city, because then I have to consider whether they will attempt to disrupt my treatment as well," she said, without looking up from the wound. "So I will ask again. Who did this?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him reassessing her. "A faction within my own court," he said finally, "called the Ashen Compact. They believe I have compromised the Covenant's interests by permitting human contact with our medical community." Marina looked up at him. "They stabbed you because you let humans treat vampires." "They stabbed me because I allowed you specifically to build this practice," he said. You have been operating under my protection for 3 years, Dr. Davenport. I assumed you were aware. She was not aware. She had understood that there was some form of sanction behind her work, some agreement between factions that permitted her to exist in this role, but she had not known that the sanction was personal, attached to a specific individual, or that the individual was someone like Silas Velkan. You protected my practice, she said. I protected you, he said, and the distinction was precise and deliberate, and she felt it somewhere in her chest in a way she did not examine immediately. She treated the wound over the next 4 hours. Simultan, the compound was sophisticated, but she was more sophisticated, and she had resources, biological and chemical, that existed at the intersection of human medical science and 3 years of supernatural pathology. She neutralized the disruption, layer by careful layer, coaxing his healing back into function, and by the time the grey early light of morning was beginning to gather outside, the wound was closing cleanly, and Silas Velkan was watching her work with an expression she would later identify as the look of a man who had just encountered something he had not expected to find. "Why did you build the practice?" he asked, at one point when she was working in silence. "Because your people needed care and no one was providing it," she said. "You could have refused the file." "I could have," she agreed. "But refusing to help people because they are inconvenient or frightening, or outside the category of people I was trained to expect, is not medicine. It is cowardice in a white coat." He was quiet after that, but he stayed. He stayed long after the wound was addressed, and she let him, because there was something in the set of his shoulders that told her that Leah felt dangerous to him in a way that had nothing to do with the Ashen Compact, and she recognized that feeling, the particular loneliness of a person who has been powerful and protective for so long that they have forgotten how to simply rest. She made coffee. She gave him a cup without asking if he wanted it, because in her experience the beings who most needed to be given something were always the ones least able to ask for it. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "You are a very unusual person, Dr. Davenport," he said. "Marina," she said, "if you're going to have been protecting me for 3 years, you should probably use my first name." "Marina," he said, and something about the way he said it, unhurried, as though he were placing it carefully in a location where he intended it to remain, did the thing to her chest again. He came back 2 weeks later. Not for treatment. He came in the evening, and he sat across from her desk, and they talked for 3 hours about the politics of the Covenant, about the Ashen Compact and their growing influence, about the ancient blood laws that governed vampire society, and the specific ways in which those laws were being weaponized by those who wanted to reverse the cautious modernization that figures like Silas had been attempting for decades. She listened. She asked questions. She was not pretending to be interested. She was genuinely interested, because the political structure of the vampire world was a system, and systems were things she understood, and the vulnerabilities in this particular system were things she could see clearly, precisely because she was an outsider to it. The Ashen Compact's argument is that contact with the human world weakens your kind, she said, but the evidence they use to support that is anecdotal and politically motivated. The actual data, your healing rates, your survival outcomes, your community cohesion, all of that has improved since the practices were established. Data does not move the court, Silas said. Tradition does. Blood law does. Fear does. Then you need someone to translate the data into the language of tradition, Marina said. You need an argument that meets them on their own terms. He looked at her for a long moment. And you believe you can do that? I think I already have better odds than anyone who's been inside the system their whole lives and has stopped being able to see its shape clearly, she said. He visited once a week after that, then twice. Then she lost count of the evenings she came up the stairs from her examination rooms. To find him in the small kitchen, she kept off the waiting area, standing by the window with a coffee he had made himself, because he had paid close enough attention to learn how she took it. And she would sit across from him, and they would work through the problems of his world, together in the lamplit quiet of the city night. She was in love with him by the 3rd month. She knew this, not because she decided it, but because she noticed its absence when he was not there. A specific hollowness in the evenings that had nothing to do with loneliness in general, and everything to do with the particular quality of his attention, The way he listened to her, as though her thoughts were the most interesting things that had arrived in his very long life. She did not say anything. She was aware of the complexity. She was aware that she was human, and he was not, and that the intersection of those two facts created problems that were not merely personal but political and ancient and potentially lethal. She was aware that his world had very specific views about the relationship between vampires and the humans in their orbit, and that some of those views were protective in the most dangerous possible interpretation of that word. What she did not fully account for was that he was in love with her too. She found this out not because he told her, but because of what happened in the 4th month, when a member of the Ashen Compact followed her home. She had been walking from the clinic to the small apartment building 4 blocks away, a route she had walked so many times it was automatic, when she became aware of footsteps that matched hers too precisely. She did not panic. She had been trained in emergency protocols by a woman from the Covenant's own security division who had appeared in her clinic one day and announced that Dr. Davenport's survival was in the interest of several parties, and therefore her preparedness was a matter of collective concern. She turned into a well-lit side street and took out her phone and sent the code she had been given for exactly this kind of situation. Silas arrived in 4 minutes. She had not been counting, but later she would realize that 4 minutes from the time of the signal to his physical presence on that street meant that he had already been nearby, that he had been watching over her himself in the specific way of someone who does not trust their own protection network as much as they trust their own presence. The member of the Ashen Compact was a vampire named Corvus, young by their standards, perhaps 2 centuries, with the specific ideological rigidity that comes from having been radicalized young and never having encountered enough reality to loosen it. He had Marina backed against the wall of the side street, not with his hands, but with the simple physical dominance of his proximity, and he was explaining to her in a very quiet voice that her clinic was going to close and she was going to leave the city because she had become a symbol of exactly the kind of contamination the Compact intended to reverse. Silas came around the corner, and the temperature of the entire street changed. Marina had seen him be many things in the month she had known him: thoughtful, dry, precise, occasionally and briefly gentle in the understated way of someone who guards gentleness carefully. She had not seen him be this, and what he was in that moment was something she understood immediately and viscerally, even if she could not name it in any language she had been taught. He was dangerous in the way of something in ancient that had decided it was done being contained. He said one sentence to Corvus. She would not repeat it, partly because she was not sure she could reproduce the exact resonance of it, the way it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, and partly because the effect of it on Corvus was so immediate and absolute that she felt it would be unkind to describe. Corvus left. Silas turned to her, and the dangerous thing receded, not entirely but enough, and what was left was something rawer. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Silas," she paused. "How long have you been watching my route home?" "A beat, since the 2nd month," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight of the side street, and the city moved around them, and she thought about all the evenings in the kitchen and all the problems they had worked through together, and all the careful distance he had maintained, and the fact that careful distance and covert personal protection were not a contradiction. If you were a person who loved someone you had not yet allowed yourself to name. "You should have told me," she said. "I was aware of the complications," he said, which was so precisely what she had told herself about her own feelings that she laughed, and the laugh seemed to undo something in him. "Marina," he said, and the way he said her name in that moment was different from every other time, less careful, more present, and he took a single step toward her and she did not step back, and in the following silence there was everything they had both been holding with both hands for months. "The complications are real," she said. "Your world has rules about this. I know they do. I have spent 3 years learning your world's rules. The rules exist to protect my kind from being weakened by attachment to beings who do not persist," he said. "The argument being that love between a vampire and a human is a trap, because the human dies and the vampire carries the wound forever." "That is a terrible argument," Marina said, "because by that logic you should never love anyone or anything at all, and the absence of love is not strength. It is just a different kind of damage. He was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. I have known for some time. He kissed her in the lamplight of the side street with the rain beginning again and the city indifferent around them. And it was not tentative in the way of people who are uncertain, but careful in the way of people who are certain and understand exactly how much the thing they are doing matters. The weeks that followed were both the best of Marina's life and the most politically complicated. Silas was careful about what he revealed within the court, not out of shame but out of strategy. He was engaged in a long, careful political campaign to shift the balance of power away from the Ashen Compact and toward the more moderate factions, and he needed his standing to remain unimpeachable for as long as possible. Marina understood this. She was not asking to be paraded through his court. She was asking to know him, and he was giving her that fully, in a way that she suspected he had not given anyone in a very long time. She learned his history gradually, in pieces. In the evenings when they stayed in the clinic kitchen, until the city went quiet outside, and the lamp between them made the world feel small enough to be entirely theirs. He was not the oldest of his kind, but he was among the most significant. Having been born in a time when the Covenant was still being formed, when the blood laws were still being written, and having spent the intervening centuries in the particular exhausting position of someone who understands power well enough to know both how to hold it and how hollow it is. He had watched people die. He had watched things end. He had accumulated losses in the patient, systematic way of immortality, and the effect of it was not brittleness, but a kind of dense, compressed sadness that he wore so quietly she had almost missed it under the authority and the precision. "Do you still want this?" she asked him once directly because she needed to know. Not in the abstract, in the specific. Me, this. Do you actually want it? He looked at her across the lamplit kitchen with those silver eyes and said, I have not wanted anything with this quality of certainty in 300 years. That is a very long time to be waiting for something, she said. Yes, he said, it is. The Ashen Compact had not been idle while Silas and Marina were building something in the quiet of the city nights. They had been working within the structure of the court, gathering testimony, constructing a case, looking for the specific mechanism that would allow them to remove Silas Velkan from his position of power permanently and legally. They found Ent in an obscure blood law called the Contamination Edict. The Contamination Edict was, in its original form, a protection against vampire lords who might be influenced or controlled by humans to the detriment of the Covenant as a whole. It had been written in an era when the relationship between vampires and humans was almost entirely adversarial, when the concept of a vampire allowing a human close enough to influence their decisions was understood as a form of strategic vulnerability. The Ashen Compact argued that Silas's relationship with Marina Davenport constituted exactly this kind of contamination. That he had allowed a human woman so deeply into his confidence and his life that she influenced the political direction of the Covenant. That this was demonstrable, and that under the Contamination Edict it constituted a crime against the blood. The crime against the blood, under the edict, carried only one sentence, the Crimson Verdict. Marina learned about this on a Wednesday morning from a source within the court who had been feeding her information for weeks. The source was a vampire named Thessaly, young and sharp-minded, who had been quietly working with Silas on his modernization efforts, and who came to Marina's clinic door at 6 in the morning with urgency written in every line of her face. They filed the charge last night, Thessaly said. The tribunal convenes at sunset. If they find against him, the verdict falls within 17 hours. Marina sat down. She sat down and she breathed for exactly 30 seconds, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, and then she stood back up. Tell me everything you know about the verdict's mechanism, she said. Medical, biological, metaphysical, everything. Marina, Thessaly said carefully, the verdict is not something that can be medically reversed. It operates outside the body. It is a blood law made manifest. It is, tell me everything you know, Marina said again. And the steadiness in her voice was not the steadiness of someone who was not afraid. It was the steadiness of someone who was very afraid, and had made a decision anyway, Thessaly told her. The Crimson Verdict worked by severing the oldest threads of vampire being. the ones that were not biological, but what Silas had once described to her as the root of what they were. The place where their nature intersected with something older and larger. It was possible, theoretically, to reverse it. But it required someone willing to offer a significant portion of their own vitality as a counter-offering to the blood law itself. A human could do this. Humans had a different relationship to the ancient laws than vampires did. A human offering was not bound by the same rules. The blood law recognized it as something outside its own architecture, and there was, in the deep structure of the edict itself, a provision for exactly this kind of challenge. The provision was never meant to be used, Thessaly said. It was written as a formality. No human has ever actually tried to invoke it. Good, Marina said. Then there is no precedent for dismissing it. She spent the day working. She pulled every resource she had, every contact in the Covenant's medical network, every piece of documentation she had accumulated over 3 years of treating supernatural patients. She compiled the biological and metaphysical argument with the same rigor she would have brought to a peer review paper, and she composed her counter-testimony with the specific, evidence-based precision of someone who knew that in this court, her only weapon was the clarity of her argument. She also, because she was Marina Davenport and she did not work without backup, prepared for the possibility that the argument would not be enough. The provision she had found in the edict was old, and it was imprecisely worded in the way of very old texts. And the question of how literally the tribunal would interpret the phrase, "a willing offerings of significant vitality," was one she could not answer in advance. She prepared for the most literal possible interpretation. She made the arrangements she needed to make. She wrote a letter she left in the locked drawer of her desk, and then she picked up her medical bag and she went to the court. She arrived to find the verdict already in place, already burning above him in the chamber's darkness, and she set her bag on the obsidian floor, and she told Vraska she wanted documentation, and the story continued from there. Vraska looked at Marina for a long time after her opening statement. The 6 other elders were still and watchful in the way of creatures for whom time moved differently, absorbing her presence and her argument with the patient deliberation of beings who had seen everything once already and were now encountering something that required a second look. "The provision you are referencing," Vraska said, "has not been invoked in the history of this covenant." "The provision exists," Marina said. "It is not historical significance that determines whether a law is valid. It is whether the law is still written, and it is still written." Silas was on his feet now, which he had not been a moment ago, and she could feel the weight of his attention on her like a physical thing. "Marina," he said, and his voice was very controlled, but underneath the control was something she recognized, the particular quality of his fear, which was not for himself. "Marina, what have you prepared?" She did not look at him yet. She kept her eyes on Vraska. "I invoke the challenger provision of the contamination edict," she said, speaking it cleanly and formally, the way Thessaly had taught her. "As a human individual standing in willing relationship with the accused, I claim the right to offer counter-vitality against the verdict's sentence and to challenge the original charge before this tribunal." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. That one had been astonishment. This one was older. This one had weight. Marina. Silas was beside her. She did not know when he had moved. He was there, and his hands were on her arms, and he was looking at her with those silver eyes, and in them was every version of the conversation they had been having for months. All the evenings in the kitchen and the side street and the lamp-lit quiet, all of it compressed into this moment. "You understand what the provision requires?" "I do," she said. "You will be giving a portion of your lifespan," he said, low, direct, not symbolically. Measurably, the blood law will take it. You will live less time than you would have otherwise. "I know," she said. "Marina, I will not allow." "You do not get to allow or disallow this," she said, and she said it without sharpness, with a gentleness that she knew was the only language that would reach him right now. "You have been protecting me for 3 years. You have been standing between me and every threat your world could generate, and I have let you do that because you were the one with the power to do it and I was not. But this is mine to do. This is the one place where I have the power and you do not, and I am going to use it." His jaw tightened. His hands on her arms tightened. He was struggling with something immense and old, and she knew exactly what it was, because she had watched him struggle with it quietly for months. It was the thing he had told her about on the night they had first been honest with each other. The deep wound of loving things that ended, the learned terror of allowing someone to sacrifice anything for you. "You are not allowed to be erased," she said quietly. "Do you understand me? That is not something I will accept. And you are not allowed to diminish your one life for the sake of mine," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way she had never heard from him before. "You have one life. I have had centuries. And you are going to have more," she said. "With me, for as long as both of us have." Vraska spoke from behind them, and her voice was quieter than it had been. "The provision is legitimate," Vraska said. "If the challenger chooses to proceed, the tribunal is bound to hear the counter-testimony, and the verdict is stayed for the duration of the proceeding." Marina turned back to the tribunal. Silas did not release her arms, but he did not pull her away. Marina presented her case. She spoke for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours she dismantled the Ashen Compact's argument, piece by piece, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been building this counter-argument for 16 hours straight, on 4 cups of coffee and the specific fuel of a person who was not going to lose. She demonstrated with documented evidence from 3 years of clinical records that her influence on Covenant medical policy had not weakened the Covenant. It had measurably strengthened it. Survival rates for critical injuries were up. The specific vulnerability to hunter compounds that had nearly killed Silas 6 months ago had been identified and could now be countered. The Ashen Compact's own membership statistics showed higher injury rates among the vampires who avoided the human-run practices than among those who used them. She argued the contamination edict on its own historical terms. She had found, in the original documentation, that Thessaly had risked considerable personal danger to obtain for her, that the edict had been written in response to a specific case, a vampire lord who had genuinely been controlled and manipulated by a human agent working for an enemy faction. The edict's language, read in its original context, was about coercive influence, not voluntary relationship. The edict was not written to prohibit love, she said, and she said the word without hesitation, standing in front of 7 ancient vampires in an obsidian chamber. It was written to prohibit manipulation. These are not the same thing. The Ashen Compact has deliberately conflated them to create a charge that does not legally exist under a correct reading of the original text. The elders conferred. Vraska and the other 6 spoke in low voices, in the language Marina did not fully know, and she stood still and waited, and Silas stood beside her, no longer holding her arms but standing close enough that she could feel the cool, contained energy of him, the specific quality of his presence that had become as familiar to her as anything in her daily life. "Whatever they decide," he said, very quietly so only she could hear, "I need you to know something." "Tell me later," she said, "when this is resolved." "I need you to know it now," he said, "because later I will be too composed again, and you will let me be, and this needs to be said without my composure in the way." A pause. "I have lived for 342 years, and I have never been grateful for my existence the way I am grateful for it now. That is entirely because of you. You are the most astonishing person I have ever known, and I am completely and permanently devoted to you, and I apologize for the complexity that comes with that, but I will not apologize for the devotion itself." Marina kept her eyes on the tribunal. Her chest was doing something significant. 342 years, she said, and that is how you choose to declare yourself. Standing in front of a vampire tribunal while your erasure is being debated. "I have always had poor timing," he said, and she heard the edge of dry humor in it, and she loved him so much in that moment that it took real effort to maintain her expression. "When this is over," she said, "we are going to have a very long conversation." "I am aware," he said. Vraska turned back to face them. "The tribunal has deliberated," she said. "The counter-testimony has been heard. The tribunal finds that the contamination edict charge, as filed by the Ashen Compact, does not meet the threshold of the original statute as written and intended." She paused. "The charge is dismissed. The crimson verdict is revoked." The red light above Silas's head went out. Marina exhaled. It was not a small exhale. It was the kind that comes after you have been holding your breath for the equivalent of 16 hours, even when you were technically breathing the whole time. Furthermore, Vraska continued, and there was something in her voice that had changed. Something that Marina could not quite name. The tribunal notes that the challenger provision was invoked by a human individual for the benefit of a vampire lord, an event that has no recorded precedent in the history of this covenant. She looked at Marina directly. The provision requires that the tribunal acknowledge and formally record the nature of the challenge. We do so. Dr. Marina Davenport's challenge is recorded in the Covenant's permanent archive. Marina was not expecting that. She absorbed it quietly. Given the legal grounds of the dismissal, Vraska said, and given the nature of the challenge's standing in relation to the accused, the tribunal moves to address the underlying question of relational status. She folded her hands. The Covenant has no mechanism for sanctioned relationship between a vampire lord and a human. That mechanism will need to be created. I will draft the proposal, Silas said, and his voice was back to its precise authority, but something underneath it had shifted permanently, and everyone in the room could hear it. See that you do, Vraska said, and Marina believed, watching her, that the ancient elder was pleased. The members of the Ashen Comp who had filed the charge were dealt with in the weeks that followed, in the particular way that vampire courts dealt with those who had used the law as a weapon, which was to say thoroughly and without appeal. Corvith, who had also been identified as the one who arranged the blade that had wounded Silas months ago, was removed from the Covenant's territory entirely. The others faced internal censure at the level that meant their political influence was effectively finished. It was not a dramatic resolution, it was an administrative one, and the administrative nature of it was in some ways more satisfying than anything else could have been because it meant the system worked. The thing Silas had spent decades trying to prove, that the Covenant's own structures could be used to protect rather than to harm, had been demonstrated. Marina and Silas spent 3 days almost entirely in her clinic after the tribunal, which sounds mundane and is in fact exactly as meaningful as it was. He slept on the examination table on the first night, because neither of them was willing to be entirely separate yet, and she woke up to find him awake and reading one of her medical textbooks with the specific expression of someone who is interested in understanding the full world of the person they love. "What are you reading?" she asked. "Your work on the interaction between supernatural healing and chemical disruption compounds," he said. "You wrote this before you ever treated me." "I had enough patience with similar presentations to identify the pattern," she said. "You were preparing for the possibility of someone like me," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I was preparing for every possibility," she said. "That is how I work." "It is," he said. He set the paper down and looked at her with that particular quality of attention, the one that always made her feel as though she was the most interesting landscape he had ever had the leisure to study. "How much of your lifespan would the provision have taken?" She had been waiting for this question. "The provision was invoked but not completed," she said. "The verdict was revoked before the counter-vitality transfer was required. I do not lose anything." He was quiet for a long moment, and if the verdict had not been revoked in time, she met his eyes steadily. "Then the answer would be approximately 12 years, Marina." "I was aware of that going in," she said. "I made the calculation deliberately. And you decided 12 years of your life was a worthwhile exchange. I decided that a world without you in it was not a world where those 12 years had any particular value," she said plainly. The way she said everything, and watched the effect of it move through him in the still air of the examination room morning. He crossed to her in 2 steps, and he held her in the way of someone who has fully decided, without reservation, without the careful management of distance, and she held him back in exactly the same way, and the morning went on around them, in the weeks and then months that followed. They built something that had no precedent in the Covenant's history, and therefore had to be constructed entirely from scratch, which Marina found more interesting than difficult. She had always been better at building new things than adapting old ones. Silas drafted the relational status proposal he had promised the tribunal, working with Marina's input and Thessaly's legal knowledge, and it became not just a personal accommodation but the foundation of a new section of the Covenant's governing documents, one that addressed the possibility of meaningful relationship between vampires and humans, In terms that were honest about both the complications and the value. He presented it to the full court on an October evening, and Marina sat in the visitors' gallery, which she had been permitted to attend as a matter of her formal recorded standing, and watched him make the argument with the particular combination of intellectual precision and personal conviction that she had come to understand as his truest mode of being. He won. The margin was not overwhelming, but it was sufficient, and it was real. He found her afterward at the corridor outside the great chamber, walking quickly in the way he always walked when he was searching for her. And she came around a corner, and they were face to face in the lamplight of the old underground corridor, all pale stone and ancient iron, and he looked at her with silver eyes full of something 342 years of careful self-management had never quite prepared him for, which was simply happiness. "It passed," she said. "It passed," he confirmed. She smiled at him, and he made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family, and he pulled her in and kissed her in the corridor of the Covenant's inner sanctum, in a way that was neither careful nor composed, but was entirely honest, and someone at the far end of the corridor politely walked in the other direction. The seasons changed, winter came, and the city went grey and silver, and Marina's clinic became busier, because the cold brought complications and vampire physiology had specific sensitivities to extreme temperature that she had documented across 3 winters now. She hired an assistant, a human woman named Petra, who had been recommended by Thessaly, and who had the specific quality of complete unflappability that the role required. Silas came to the clinic most evenings, not because she asked him to, but because it had become the place he thought of as home, in the particular way that a place becomes home when the person you love is in it. He was there when a court messenger arrived on a winter Tuesday with a sealed envelope bearing the tribunal's crest. Marina opened it, read it, looked up. "What is it?" Silas asked. "Vraska's request is that I be considered for a formal advisory position to the Covenant's Medical Affairs Council," Marina said, and she heard her own voice carrying the specific quality of surprised pleasure she rarely allowed herself. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and then looked away to the window where the city snow was falling, and something in his profile was so open that she wanted to preserve it. That particular look of a man who has everything he wanted and is still slightly amazed by it. "It was always going to happen," he said. "Anyone who watched you for 5 minutes in that tribunal knew, even Vraska. Especially Vraska," he said. "She told me afterward that you were the most formidable person she had encountered in 200 years. He paused. "She said it as a complaint. I understood it as praise." Marina laughed. "Will you take it?" he asked. "Oh, of course I will take it," she said. "Someone needs to make sure that council makes decisions that are actually based on evidence rather than tradition for its own sake." "That someone," he said, "is absolutely you." Spring came. The long, careful winter of building and settling and finding the shape of their shared life gave way to something warmer and more certain, on an evening in April when the city smelled of rain and new growth. Silas asked Marina to walk with him to the rooftop of the building above her clinic, which had a small garden she had never visited before, and she went because she trusted him completely, and also because she was curious about where he was going with this. The rooftop was lit with something she could not immediately identify. Small lights strung in patterns that had clearly been arranged with deliberate care, and the city moved below them in all directions. And he was standing in the middle of it, looking at her with those silver eyes in the lamplight, and she understood immediately that this had been planned. "You do not do anything without preparation," she said. "I learned that from you," he said. "What are you preparing for right now?" He took a breath, which was a thing she had noticed he only did when he was about to say something that mattered to him beyond his usual careful maintenance. 342 years, he said, and I have been through things I cannot fully describe, and I have carried things I cannot fully put down, and I have spent the majority of my existence in the particular state of someone who has chosen sufficiency over joy, because joy seemed too fragile to trust. He paused. "You changed that. You changed it by being exactly what you are, which is someone who meets the world directly and refuses to manage it from a distance, and who looked at everything that I am, including the difficult parts, and did not flinch and did not leave." Marina was very still. I am asking you to make your life with me, he said. Not as an accommodation to my world or mine to yours, but as a genuine shared thing built together, the way we have been building everything else. Mornings in the kitchen and problems solved together, and your work and my work and all of it, indefinitely, for as long as we both persist. He held her gaze. I know what persists means for each of us. I know the mathematics of it are not simple. I am asking anyway, because the alternative, which is not asking, is something I am completely unwilling to accept. The city breathed around them. Marina stepped forward, and she took his face in her hands, which she had done many times by now, but which never lost the particular quality of chosen intention. And she looked at him clearly. The mathematics are not simple, she agreed. But I am very good at complicated mathematics, and I have always preferred problems that require real work to ones that resolve too easily. She held his gaze. Yes, obviously yes. I cannot imagine a version of my life I want more. He kissed her in the rooftop garden, with the April city below them, and the lights around them. And it was not the first time, but it had the particular weight of a thing being made official. A formal declaration offered and accepted, the kind of moment you return to in memory for the rest of your life and always find it whole. There were complications. There would always be complications. The covenant continued its slow, contested evolution towards something more humane, with Silas at the center of it and Marina increasingly at his side, formally as an advisory presence, and informally as the person who understood his thinking better than anyone alive because she had been present while he was developing it. The question of longevity was real, and they did not ignore it. Marina had always been rigorous about the things she could not wish away. She was human, and she would age, and he would not, and they addressed this directly. On a night when they were sitting across from each other in the clinic kitchen, the lamp between them as always. There are options, he said, for longevity. They are not simple, and I would not offer them without your full understanding of what they involve, and I would not want you to choose them out of duty to me or fear of leaving me. What are they? She asked, and he told her, clearly and completely. The vampire covenant had, over centuries, developed what was essentially a formal process for extending a human life in alignment with a vampire partner, not a transformation, not the specific and irreversible change that full vampiric conversion involved, but a form of sustained partnership that drew on the covenant's oldest blood law framework to anchor a human life at a different rate of progression. It was rare. It had been used perhaps a dozen times in the covenant's recorded history. It required the agreement of both parties and the sanction of the tribunal. I am not asking you to make this decision now, Silas said. I am telling you it exists because you would never forgive me for not telling you. No, she agreed. I would not. It would change the nature of your life in ways that are not purely positive, he said. Your relationship with the human world would shift. The work you do would continue, but your context within it would become more complicated. My context within the human world is already extremely complicated, Marina said. I have been treating vampires for 4 years, and I am formally advised to a supernatural governing council. My relationship with ordinary human life ended a while ago. Marina, he said, with the particular quality of voice that meant he needed her to be serious. I am being serious, she said. I do not need to decide this now, but I also do not need to pretend that the decision is harder than it actually is for me. She looked at him steadily. I love my life. I love my work. But the thing that gives the life its specific meaning, the person I am doing all of it in relation to, that is you. That has been you for a long time now. Whatever form my life takes going forward, the version I want is the one that includes you. He was quiet for a long moment. You are very certain, he said. I am always very certain, she said. You know this about me. I know it, he said. I have been counting on it. She applied to the tribunal for consideration of the longevity partnership. Vraska reviewed the application personally, which was unusual for a sitting elder, and which Marina understood as a form of attention that was the closest Vraska came to warmth. Vraska approved it. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was small. Thessaly was there. 2 of Silas's oldest allies within the court were there. Marina had told 2 people from her human life, the only 2 who had always known the full truth of what she did and who she was, and they were there. Petra, Her clinic assistant had made dessert that she declared suitable for consumption by multiple categories of being, which was perhaps the most complicated baking brief anyone had ever been given. And it was excellent. What happened in the ceremony was formal and old, and Marina felt the change immediately afterward, not dramatically but clearly. The way you feel the shift in pressure before weather changes, a settling into something new. She was still herself. She was still Marina Davenport, the healer who had walked into her own basement clinic 4 years ago and decided to make a place in the world where the impossible could receive the same standard of care as the ordinary. She was still the woman who did not flinch and did not manage from a distance and did not accept that the people she loved could be taken without a fight. But she was also, now, something more, which was the formally recognized partner of Silas Velkan, recorded in the Covenant's permanent archive, anchored to the deep structure of the oldest living community of beings on the earth, with all the protection and responsibility that entailed. "How do you feel?" Silas asked her very quietly in the room after everyone else had given them a moment. "Certain," she said. "The same way I always feel when I have made the right decision, and the right decision is very clear to you." "The right decision has been clear to me for approximately 2 years," she said. "I was simply waiting for the circumstances to align." "You planned this," he said, with the edge of dry amusement she loved in him. "I planned everything," she said. "I thought you knew that about me." He laughed, fully, the way he rarely did in public but increasingly did with her, and she held the sound of it carefully because it was one of her favorite things in the world. The clinic continued. The work continued. The Covenant continued its slow evolution. Marina sat on the Medical Affairs Council and made arguments that were evidence-based and refused to be dismissed, and over the following years those arguments changed the texture of policy in ways that were small and incremental and would take decades to fully manifest, which was fine, because she had decades now. Silas continued his work within the political structure of the Covenant, the careful long game of moving an ancient and resistant institution towards something better, and he had Marina to come home to, which had transformed the work in ways that were not strategic but were somehow as significant as any strategy, because the difference between working from exhaustion and working from a grounded and replenished place is not small. There were still difficult nights. There were still moments when the weight of what he carried and the complexity of what she had stepped into arrived at the same time and pressed hard. On those nights they sat in the clinic kitchen with the lamp between them, and they talked through everything until it was manageable, the way they had always done, the way that had been the real foundation of everything else. On a night in late autumn, several years after the crimson verdict had burned above his head in the obsidian chamber, and she had walked in and put her medical bag on the floor and refused the premise, they were sitting in the kitchen and the city was quiet outside, and the lamp was warm between them. And Marina was reading something, and Silas was watching her with those silver eyes, in the way of someone who is entirely at peace with where they are, and she looked up and caught him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am simply looking." "You look at me like I am interesting," she said. "You are the most interesting person I have ever met," he said, "in 340-something years. Which is, I want to be very clear, an enormous field of candidates." "I am aware," she said, and she smiled. "I was thinking," he said, "that I would like to tell you something I have been intending to say more directly for some time and have found myself circling." "Tell me," she said. "The night you walked into the tribunal," he said. "When I turned and saw you standing in the door of the sanctum with your medical bag in your hand telling Vraska you wanted documentation." He paused. "I want you to know that that was the moment I understood that every century I had spent arriving at that point was, in retrospect, exactly the correct amount of time to spend. Because it brought me to the specific moment where you existed and walked into that room. And every moment before that was just distance between me and you." Marina was very still, the way she went still when something moved her completely. "Silas," she said. "I know you prefer directness," he said. "So I am being direct. I am completely and permanently in love with you, and my life with you is the best thing I have known, and I wanted to say it without occasion or ceremony, on an ordinary evening, which is what you deserve." Ordinary evenings where it is said, clearly. She put down her reading. She reached across the lamplit space between them, and took his hand, which was cool and real and completely steady in the way of something ancient and certain. "I love you," she said, which was also direct, because she was Marina Davenport, and she did not manage things from a distance. Completely and without reservation, and with full awareness of every complicated thing that comes with it. "Which is, for the record, considerable." "Considerable," he agreed. "And I would not change a single complicated thing," she said. "Neither would I," he said. The lamp burned between them, and the city moved outside the window, and they stayed in the kitchen for a long time after that, talking about small things and significant things the way people do when they are genuinely happy, which is the particular luxury of knowing that the large question has been answered and the remaining questions are the good kind, the ones that unfold rather than threaten. At some point she fell asleep in her chair, because she was human and humans required sleep, and he did not wake her but stayed where he was across the table, reading her work on compound disruption because he had been meaning to finish it for 2 years, and the lamp added between them, and the clinic was warm, and the city was quiet outside, and inside that kitchen was the kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone who faces it with you, which is the only kind that actually lasts. The crimson verdict had fallen on him, and the human healer had given everything to reverse it, not just in the tribunal, but in every moment before it and every moment after. And what came back to them both, on the other side of the forbidden charge, and the blood law, and the ancient court, and the sacrifice that had been necessary, and the declaration that had been made, was not merely his life, it was everything. She woke to find him still there, silver-eyed in the lamplight, steady as something made to last. And he looked at her when she woke the way he always looked at her, as though her existence was the specific and deliberate answer to something he had spent 3 centuries asking, without quite forming the question. And she looked back at him the way she always looked at him, directly and without distance and with the fullness of everything she was. "Good morning," she said, although it was still the deep middle of the night. "Good morning," he said. Outside, the city went on in all its human brightness. Below them, the clinic waited, full of work and purpose, the intersection of 2 worlds that had no business fitting together until they did, maintained by the particular determination of a woman who refused to accept that impossible and irreversible meant the same thing. They built the rest of their life from that kitchen, from that lamp, from the accumulated weight of every evening they had spent together, turning large and complicated things into manageable ones. They built it from trust and from the specific courage it takes to love someone whose world is not your own, and from the knowledge that the strongest protection is not standing in front of something, but standing beside it, facing the same direction, choosing the same destination. It was not a simple story, and it was not a small life, but it was entirely, completely, and in every way that mattered, theirs.